Why are we here today? So we all know that Europe is committed to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And I'm also sure that everybody here in this room knows that massive investments will be needed to realize this goal and to make a transition to a fully decarbonized economy happen. The European Commission has estimated that the investment will the investments needs will approximately be around 520 billion per year until 2030, in addition to what we are already investing. And what is striking, though, is that we have actually never talked so much about investment needs, but have never actually invested so little. So take Germany, for instance. The public investments accounted for 5% in the 70s, so 5% of GDP, but continued to decline until now. And today we are about 2% of GDP in Germany. And this is very much also, this downward trends is very much also reflected in other parts of the European Union. However, public funding plays a crucial role in bridging massive investment gaps for the transition. This is also due to the fact that, as a McKinsey study has also found out, about 60% of investments for the green transition do not have a business case. So state institutions do have a very crucial function here and make public funding also a vehicle to mobilize private investments into many much needed investments for the future. Next slide, please. As you might also, everybody here be aware of that, the EU fiscal rules constrain member states to adequately address important investments, and they also provide very little flexibility to react to crisis. And the European Commission is very well aware of this shortcoming and released the relaunching of the review of the EU economic governance framework in autumn last year. And actually, next week on Wednesday, the European Commission is also expected to come forward with new ideas for the EU economic governance framework. So our discussions here are very timely. And over the course of this year, we saw in many different capitals, different standpoints on the reforms of fiscal rules, and saw also some rather surprising alliances. And among member states, there seems to be already quite a vast consensus that the reforms as they are currently stand are due for a reform. And on the one hand, there also seem to be some alignment on positions that the reforms shall place a greater emphasis on the limitation of public expenditure as opposed to the current focus on government budget balances. And there seemed to be also some agreement that this operational target shall rather be country-specific than a one-size-fits-all solution. And on the other hand, there is also some sort of an agreement that there needs to be some preferential treatment for important investments for the future. Obviously, this remains to be seen how this will play out politically within the current governance frameworks, whether this will then kind of have the form of the submission of plans or a greater enhanced role of the MTOs. However, in academia, those two rules are called an expenditure rule on the one hand and a golden rule on the other hand. And whilst there seemed to be some consensus that a reform in those two directions might be needed, there is very little talk about the specific design of such rules. And this is exactly what we did with our study. So we tried, in this publication, you will find a comparison of different designs of both an expenditure rule and the golden rule, and a description of the main features, proposals, and differences of an expenditure rule and the golden rule. We also conducted a quantitative analysis of the impact of those rules, differentiating between several designs, and concluded also with an outlook of ideas for an enhanced EU economic governance framework beyond the revision of those rules. I will hand over to Lucas now to go a bit deeper into the content of our study.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia, and also a very warm welcome from my side to everyone. So as Lydia has just mentioned, an expenditure rule is one of the feasible reform proposals that we look at. But how does this expenditure rule exactly work? So under an expenditure rule, the nominal net public expenditures cannot grow faster than the medium-term nominal potential output. But what does that exactly mean? So the net public expenditures are basically public expenditure minus some sort of deductible spending, for example, interest spending or unemployment spending. What exactly that spending that is deductible is then subject to a political decision. But whatever is agreed as deductible will then be subtracted from the public expenditure, and then this net public expenditure cannot grow faster than the medium-term nominal potential output. Potential output itself is basically the level of GDP an economy achieves independent of the business cycle. So basically the level of GDP an economy arrives at when it's neither in a recession nor in a boom. And then the idea is that if the net public expenditure grows in line with this real potential output, and we assume that the revenue to GDP ratio remains constant, that then both the public expenditure and the public revenues grow in line with this potential output, and therefore debt will not increase. But then what about the countries that are not only supposed to stabilize their debt levels, but that are supposed to reduce their debt levels because they have potentially high debt levels? For these countries, then the debt correction factor comes into play. So as the name suggests, the debt correction factor would correct the allowed public expenditure growth as indicated by the real potential output for a value that ensures that in the long term, countries achieve their debt target. So let's assume a country has a debt to GDP ratio of say 80%, then this debt to GDP ratio is 20 percentage points above the 60% target of the European treaties. So therefore, if we assume that countries have 20 years of time to achieve their debt target, as it's currently set out in the European Fiscal Rules under the so-called 120s rule, this country would then have to reduce its debt by 1 percentage point per year. So in this case, the debt correction factor would correct the allowed public expenditure growth for a value that then ensures that in the long run, this country achieves the 60% debt target. There are some strengths and weaknesses to this rule. While we don't have time to go into detail here, let me quickly mention that an expenditure rule definitely can promote counter-cyclicality, so giving member states more fiscal leeway in recessions than in booms. It's also less prone to measurement errors and revisions than the current rules. It can allow for country-specific debt reduction. In terms of weaknesses, probably the biggest problem is the uncertainty of measurement. So for example, measuring discretionary revenue measures, for example, is quite challenging, or it also still relies, of course, on measuring potential output. Then next slide, please. If we look at the difference between all the various proposals for an expenditure rule, we end up with such an admittedly complex table that you can see on the right-hand side. So if you want to understand all the details of the difference between the rules, I recommend to look into our paper. But what I can summarize here is that there are three clusters of important differences between the rules. So the first is concerning the expenditure aggregate. So the question, which expenditure is actually considered in this rule? Will it consider interest expenditure or, for example, unemployment spending, or will it exclude those items from the expenditure aggregate? Once that is agreed, then the question is, how much can that expenditure aggregate grow? So as I said, it's supposed to grow in line with medium-term growth of real potential output, but then the question is how to adjust for inflation, how to adjust for example, past expenditure overruns in which countries spent too much in previous year and then have to compensate for that. And then very importantly, the debt correction factor. So here there are two very important aspects. On the one hand, the long run debt to GDP target, with the question being whether that remains at 60% as it's currently with the fiscal rules, or whether that could be increased to 90% as, for example, suggested by the IMK, the German Economic Research Institute, or even increase to 100% as suggested, for example, by the European Stability Mechanism. And then similarly, the debt adjustment speed, with the question here being whether the debt adjustment speed remains at 20 years. So that would mean countries have 20 years of time to achieve their long-run debt target, or whether that could be increased to, for example, 50 years as suggested by a Bruegel paper, or decreased to 15 years as, for example, suggested by the European Fiscal Board. Yeah, next slide, please. As Lydia also mentioned, the second quite feasible reform proposal is some sort of preferential treatment for investment expenditure, which is often referred to in the literature as a golden rule or green golden rule. So here, eligible investment expenditure would be excluded from fiscal constraints so that it can be debt financed. So here it would again be a political decision to agree on which investment expenditure are so important that they should be excluded from the fiscal rules. The strength here is certainly that it provides targeted fiscal leeway at national level, and it prevents underinvestments, which then directly promotes intergenerational fairness. But the intergenerational fairness here not only comes, or it's not only fair for future generations that profit from the investments that we make today, but also present generations profit, because the debt financing nature of these investments would then allow future generations to participate in the financing of these investments, and it wouldn't have to be done entirely by raising taxes in the present, for example. In terms of weaknesses, it's certainly challenging to define and measure the eligible investments. There's also the risk of creative accounting, so member states could be incentivized to basically treat consumption expenditure in their accounting as investment expenditure in order to also exclude them from the rules. And at least in the short term, there could be debt sustainability concerns. So in the short term, investments would or could increase the debt level, which in the short term could bring up debt sustainability concerns. Next slide, thanks. So here again, we compare the most relevant proposals for such a rule. And again, we identify basically three clusters of differences. So the first one is the deductible investment. So which investment would actually be considered? Would it be possible to exclude all investment or only the net investment? And then would it be possible to include all investment or only the green investments, for example? Then the question would be, how would that investment be identified? Would that be done through the national account system? Is there potentially a cap to that? So could member states exclude an unlimited amount of investments from the rules, or would that be capped to, for example, 1 or 1.5% of GDP? And then how is the rule operationalized? So would that be coupled to a new expenditure rule? Or would it be coupled to the existing fiscal rules? Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. Besides from understanding the differences among these designs and theory, we also want to look at the practical impacts that would have on the member states. So let's start with the expenditure rule. Here we forecast the effects of different expenditure rule designs on 3 selected member states, namely Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. The reason being, on the one hand, that they are relatively powerful within the EU, on the other hand, that they have different starting positions, so to say. So as you can see in the table, Germany and Netherlands still have lower debt levels than Italy, and higher budget balances. So it's quite interesting to compare the effects among countries with different starting positions. Next slide, please. So what we then do is we use the year 2019 as a baseline year, basically, and forecast the effects on member states of different rules, of different expenditure rules for the years 2020 to 2023. The reason here being that 2019 was the last pre-crisis year, and we don't want the current crisis to distort our results. So therefore, we use 2019 as a baseline year and then forecast the effects for the year 2020 to 2023. We do that for 3 budgetary variables: the budget balance to GDP ratio and the debt to GDP ratio, as they are relevant for the Maastricht criteria of 3% deficit and 60% debt ratio. And then also the net expenditure to GDP ratio as the main variable targeted by the expenditure rule. In terms of the different designs that we look at in our quantitative analysis, we focus on the debt correction factor. Why the debt correction factor? The debt correction factor definitely has the biggest impact on member states. You will soon see that in our results. Quantitatively, the impact is highest here. Also, capturing other differences that I've presented in the table previously is quite challenging because, for example, forecasting discretionary revenue measures or temporary one-off measures is quite challenging. But what we can do here is not only compare an expenditure rule with a debt correction factor and without a debt correction factor, but also the different specific designs of the debt correction factor. And you will see that that is super important. So it's very relevant whether the debt correction factor envisaged a debt target of 60% or 90% or 100%, and also how much time countries get to achieve that target, whether they need to achieve it in a 15 years time frame or 20 years time frame or 50 years time frame. And then last but not least, we also have 2 different interest rate scenarios. First, calculating the effects with the low interest rates that we've seen in 2019, and then also for the higher interest rates that we're currently seeing. Next slide, please. Thanks. So before looking at the results, maybe let me just start with a quick disclaimer that obviously our approach also has some limitations. So for example, we haven't modeled the results, but we build on formulas that we've retrieved from the European Fiscal Board annual reports. So certainly it's a limitation in a sense that we, for example, since we don't model the results, we cannot capture growth effects. So for example, potential positive effects of more fiscal leeway granted to member states that are then able to invest cannot be captured in this analysis. I can highly recommend a similar analysis of the IMK done by Sebastian Watzka and a colleague, and Sebastian is also in this call today. And they actually do similar things, but they model it with a Niger model. Yeah, that said, as a disclaimer, let's look at the results. We start with an expenditure rule without a debt correction factor. So here you can see for the 3 countries under analysis, the effects of introducing such a rule in 2019 or in the beginning of 2020. And that would mean that the expenditure ratios would increase for all of them. As a result, the budget balance would deteriorate, and the effect on the debt is quite ambiguous and depends on basically on the interest rates that the countries face, and also the expected growth effects or the potential output effects. So if we compare that to the expenditure rule with a debt correction factor on the next slide, we now have to basically zoom in on Italy, because Italy is the only country among those 3 that in 2019 had a debt ratio of more than 60%. So only for Italy, this debt correction factor even applies. For Germany and Netherlands, it doesn't apply because they are already below 60% of debt. So zooming in on Italy, we can then compare the situation of an expenditure rule without debt correction factor, which is presented by the yellow line, with a situation of a debt correction factor with an expenditure rule with a debt correction factor. And we distinguish between the 3 different possible debt targets that are proposed in the literature, the 100%, the 90%, and the 60% target. And we see that independent of which target is used, the expenditure ratio drops, the budget balance as a result increases, and the debt ratio decreases. However, this effect is certainly most strongest for the expenditure rule with a debt correction factor with a 60% debt target. So the stricter the debt target, the more or the stronger the required fiscal consolidation of Italy. So as you can see, in this case, Italy would have to drastically cut their net expenditures and would have to generate budgetary surpluses. Then if we look at the next slide, we do the same thing basically for comparing the different debt adjustment speeds. And here you see a similar effect. So you see a drop in net expenditure ratio, an increase in the budget balance, and a drop in the debt ratio. And again, this is strongest for the strictest debt adjustment speed. So with a debt adjustment speed of only 15 years, the required fiscal consolidation for Italy would be highest. On the next slide, then we compare, or we basically combine different debt targets with different debt adjustment speeds. And what is super interesting here, in my opinion, is to see that actually, at least for Italy in this short term that we analyze until 2023, or lowering the debt adjustment speed would give Italy more fiscal leeway than increasing the debt target. And that is quite interesting because from a legal perspective, reducing the debt adjustment speed would be easier than changing the debt target. And as these results suggest, it could also be, at least in the time frame that we look at, could take more pressure off the budgets of Italy than raising the debt target. Then on the next slide, we bring in this perspective of increased interest rates. So we don't have to look into all the details again. So Maxi, if you can go to the next slide, we can just quickly see that for a specific expenditure rule for Italy, the higher interest rates would require Italy to have a stronger fiscal consolidation, to therefore have a higher budget balance in order to then actually still achieve the same debt target, even though interest rates are higher. So basically meaning that with these high interest rates, we're currently seeing the required fiscal consolidation under a strict expenditure rule with a strict debt correction factor would increase even more. Okay, next slide, please. Then let's look at the golden rule, or the green golden rule. Here we compare investment needs and investment gaps with the amount of money that is set free by this rule. We can only do that for Germany, unfortunately, because data availability for the Netherlands and Italy was not sufficient. But what we can nicely see here for Germany is that if we put these different values of public green investment need, public green investment gap into perspective with the golden rule proposals with different caps. So here we have the 1% cap and the 1.5% cap. We see that a golden rule with a 1.5% cap wouldn't limit Germany's ability to invest in the green and just transition, as this cap is higher than the 46 billion euro of investment need. However, a 1% cap would actually, it would not limit filling the public green investment gap, but it wouldn't be enough to allow all the green investment needs that are needed for the green and just transition to be excluded from the rule. So therefore, there would still remain some sort of conflict in the budget planning between investment and other items of the budget planning. Okay, next slide, please. With that, we will go to the question whether all these presented proposals will be enough in the end. And with that, I hand back to Lydia.
Yeah, we conclude that neither an expenditure rule nor a golden rule, nor a combination of both, will guarantee sufficient quality nor quantity of public funding for realizing a green and just transition. And also, we live in times where a crisis rather became the new norm. It makes it more important for the EU economic governance framework to prepare for various rather doomy scenarios. And in our publication, we highlight on 3 levels where we see much potential to enhance the current EU economic governance framework beyond revising the existing rules with the aim to make it future fit. And the first one is that we see a need to integrate climate risks in debt sustainability analysis. This is because there is evidence that both acute climate-related events, such as extreme weather phenomena, as well as long-term transition risks, can significantly impact the stability of public finances. And we see a need to systemically assess and consider those costs of climate change in form of physical risks and transitional risks. And this requires a better understanding of the fiscal impacts of climate change, and also factoring in climate risks in long-term country-specific debt analysis. And with regards to the reform ideas that the Commission will now bring forward, this is actually much debated currently whether debt sustainability analysis can serve as a basis for country-specific debt reduction pathways. And we think that this requires somehow a new understanding of debt sustainability and what also needs to be considered within such a the debt sustainability analysis. Secondly, stay at the same slide, please. Yes. Secondly, the sustainability of public finances also depend on the quality of public investments and spending. So think, for instance, about the COVID pandemic and how it revealed vulnerabilities, notably underfunded health institutions in many corners of the EU, and with precautionary fiscal policy, some of these costs could have possibly been avoided. The same counts for green transitions. We know that not spending now will cost us more in the future, and also public subsidies in harmful practices might also cost us more in the future if we don't revert them now. So this is why binding requirements and targets for the quality of public finances at a national level could be a beneficial way forward, having direct and indirect benefits for a green transition. This could also mean the implementation of anti-corruption recommendations into fiscal policy and the commitment to end harmful public subsidies and make it do no significant harm compliant. And finally, we see a need for a centralized fiscal capacity at EU level to achieve common policy goals. This is also to address some cross-border challenges in relation with various policy areas such as climate, biodiversity, migration, energy, health. I think the list is long, and such a permanent fiscal capacity can support the cohesion by aligning national fiscal policies with the needs of the entire Eurozone. And we already have some sort of a blueprint for that with the Recovery and Resilience Facility for such a joint fiscal capacity, how this could be set up. Now you can take me to the conclusion. So with our publication, we could show that a consensus about a reform of the rules is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for really achieving a green and just transition. But with regards to an expenditure rule, we could show that the choice of the debt target and the debt adjustment speed are crucial in determining the impact of such a rule. And for a golden rule, we could also show that the decision over deductible investments and the cap, that they determine also the impact of this rule. And together, we say that beyond these rules, we see a need for a reform of the framework, and also for rethinking our understanding, for instance, of debt sustainability as a whole. I will close it with these words, and I'm also curious to hear from you whether you have any questions or thoughts and comments. Please feel free to post them in the chat. We landed almost on time. We promised that we will stop at 1:30 to also leave about 15 minutes for your questions. So yeah, please do not hesitate to come forward with your comments and questions. And thank you for listening. I can see a hand up. Jan, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Hi everyone, Kieran Humphreys from E3G based in Berlin. Thanks for the very interesting presentation and also for the well done on the great paper. I haven't had a chance yet to dig into it, but it looks really, really interesting. Very interested in your conclusion that we need sort of the progressive reform of the fiscal rules, but that it's necessary but not sufficient condition. And I think it's very useful that you're having this looking beyond the SGP and the reform of that. Think of other ways that we can kind of get the necessary investment unlocked for the green transition. My question would be on the two kind of solutions that you talk about in the paper, right? So you have your expenditure rule and your green golden rule. In your view, does the final sort of shape of the reform need to have both of these in order to unlock enough of that investment in the green transition, or like just, you know, enough to get us to at least part of the way there? Or could we have, for example, a design of an expenditure rule, which is possibly going to be in the Commission's proposal or connected to it? Is there like a design of the expenditure rule that could really unlock a lot of that investment on its own, or does it need the green golden rule to kind of bolster it as well? Yeah, just to clarify that, because it was very interesting to hear about the expenditure rule, but I'm not sure I fully understood the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I mean, in general, yes, we need both. I think the question is just whether we define the golden rule to be basically part of an expenditure rule or to be something separate. So we definitely need some sort of preferential treatment for investment expenditure. It can either be implemented by both an expenditure rule and then this golden rule, as we called it, because it's called that way in the literature. I think what's more realistic is probably to have an expenditure rule, and then, as I said, within the expenditure rule, there's this discussion about what is excluded in the expenditure aggregate, and then there's the possibility to exclude investment expenditure within the expenditure rule. So then it would basically be a combined solution. I think there's currently a lot of talk also about this possibility to have member states then submit national plans, national investment plans that could also be part of an expenditure rule. Then member states would submit these plans, would present their ideas of which investment they would like to make, and then within the expenditure rule, the Commission could, for example, suggest to exclude these type of investment expenditure from the expenditure aggregate of the expenditure rule.
Thank you, Lucas. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks very much. That was really helpful and good to see the nuances there, how you could bring it in.
Great. Thank you also, Sebastian, for the link in the chat to your publication, where you also arrived at similar conclusions that really the design of an expenditure rule matters, and that you have done some simulations of the effects. I think this is also really a useful complement to our study. And thank you, Till, for your question. Do you want to come in and post a question orally as well?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation and yeah, for the assessment in the paper. My question was, and if you don't have those insights, that's totally fine. But I was just wondering whether you had the chance in the time of the preparation to get some more insights on the different coalitions or strong. Maybe there's already like a coalition of member states, maybe within the EU, that favor a certain setup of proposal. I would just be curious to get some more information on that.
Yeah, thank you. So we did a year ago a feasibility and impact analysis of our studies, where we also assessed the political feasibility, and the result of this was actually that a golden rule and an expenditure rule is actually the most politically and legally feasible reform option. This is also why we landed on this publication here and now. And we have looked into more specifically also Germany, the Netherlands and Italy. And it is, well, our conclusion is that they all see the need to come to some kind of form of reform on these kind of 2 points, like being an expenditure rule and a golden rule. But for instance, Germany is not that clear. I think that they say they would like to have like an investment clause rather than a golden rule. So I think, yeah, we will see it probably in the next couple of months how this will play out politically. And I'm also really curious to hear from this group here and now if they have more insights into also the political side of things. And also, Lucas, feel free to complement what I have just said.
Actually, I think there's nothing to complement. That summarized it quite nicely.
I also see a hand from Sebastian. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for your nice presentation. I also think it's very interesting to analyze the combined effects, like having the expenditure rule and the golden rule. I mean, the golden rule would make a lot of sense from an economic perspective, and it's a little bit unfortunate that in Germany we had, I don't know, 10 years ago or maybe even more, the debt break then, because before that we did have a golden rule in our basic law, in our constitution, and so it would be, of course, very useful to re-establish it at the EU level. And also, I think you hinted at the sort of difficult decision what is to be included in the what do you count as public investment then as green investment. I have to say I didn't quite understand the chart Lucas presented with where you said that this is the gap. So maybe you could either afterwards or now again to just briefly summarize again, because I think it's very important to have enough sort of public funding available for the investment needs in the future. Only a short comment with the interest rates, where you said low and higher interest rates. I assume you meant then real interest rates, because it's not so clear to me that the higher nominal interest rate would be such a problem by itself if the inflation rate is also going up at the same time. So what I expect to happen is, with higher inflation, the debt burden actually being sort of diminished by itself. So that could, kick in and sort of make it easier to reduce high debt ratios if we are now in a more inflationary environment, irrespective of the nominal interest rate. So we can discuss this also later maybe, but it's not clear to me that the interest rate by itself or higher nominal rates would necessarily make it more difficult to. The reason why I say this is because it could mean, of course, that interest rates are going up now, so we have to be more careful on our expenditure side. But if you see what's happening on the German fiscal side, there's an enormous increase in tax revenue because of higher inflation, and that, of course, will make it easier to get rid of that burden in the future. So I think we have to be very careful in investigating that.
Thanks. Yeah, on the last point, I think that's certainly quite interesting, and I mean we haven't been able to capture that obviously in our estimations, because, as I said, we didn't use a model, so we haven't been able to model future tax revenues, for example. But certainly something interesting to explore in the future. For the first question, Maxi, maybe you can quickly bring me back to the slide on the results for the golden rule. That's the slide you were referring to, Sebastian, right? Okay. So here we have we've looked into the literature and we've tried to find public investment needs and gaps for Germany. So basically looking at papers and looking at, okay, how or what is the overall public investment need in Germany? What of that is for green purposes? And then which part of that is the gap? So which is basically the difference between the need and what is already supplied. And then we compare that to basically what you see here for 1% of GDP and 1.5% of GDP. This value that you see here, 52 billion, for example, or 35, is basically just 1% of the German GDP or 1.5% of the German GDP, because the logic of a golden rule with a cap would be that the allowed investment expenditure that can be excluded from the rules would be limited to either 1% or 1.5% of GDP, at least according to the proposals that we looked at. So basically, we just wanted to compare, or we just wanted to analyze whether if such a cap applies, would that restrict the member states, in this case, Germany, too much? And as we can see, the 1.5% of GDP is actually more than the public green investment needs. So it wouldn't limit Germany's ability to invest in the green transition, because all the public green investment needs together would still be lower than 1.5% of GDP per year at least. For the 1%, it would limit the public green investment need. So the logic being, if we only look at the investment gap, it wouldn't be limited because the 1% is more than the gap, but it's less than the overall need. So the overall need that that Germany needs to meet the investments of the green and just transition are higher than this 1% gap. So then in the future, there would still be a trade-off between different budgetary positions between investment and then consumption expenditure. I don't know if that helped.
Yes, thanks. But can I then add on a short question only? But so here you only talk about the green public investment, and so the overall public investment, which is 200 billion euros in your chart, we would have to finance somehow from different sources, so to say.
True. So unfortunately, we didn't find reliable numbers for the overall public investment gap. So this is just a need, and a lot of that is already supplied, and it's then the question of how big the gap remains. But certainly, if we look at the overall public investment needs, then such a cap would be way more restrictive.
Right, we have reached the end of our webinar. It's 1:45. I thank you all for your participation and for your questions. We remain at your disposal if you have any further questions or if you want to engage with us bilaterally. Again, thank you so much for coming, and hope to speak to you soon. Thanks, Till. I just read your comment in the chat. Yeah, that's really right, that we have to also highlight that the fiscal reform will not be sufficient for the investment gap, and we need to identify some different levers to that, and taxation is indeed something that we are also looking at. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to speak to you all soon again. Bye bye.
Thanks everyone, have a nice day.
Thank you.